Okay, I want to thank again Rav Natty for organizing the whole. I've lost track of how many years, and we'll take the challenge of doing this again by Zoom. And I hope my connection's okay. If it goes bad, you'll tell me, and I'll change the my provider. Okay, let me explain the title. Let me share my screen. I'll explain my title, and we'll get to work. The title actually isn't the topic. It's actually it's the title, not the topic. I'll explain what I mean. What came first, Sefer Bereishit or Sefer Shemot? But the answer, obviously, Sefer Bereishit came first. That's an easy question. I want to make one basic claim, and then in the share I want to prove it. What's my claim? My claim is, I'm not 100% sure, but I want to entertain this idea that when I'm reading Sefer Bereishit, I'm reading a book that was written first and foremost for the nation that came out of Egypt, that went through oppression, redemption, is about to receive the Torah at Har Sinai, and they need to understand why they've been chosen. I need to know they need to know where they're going to, where they're coming from, what it's all about. When I read Sefer Bereishit, from that perspective, it's going to explain a lot of the details which otherwise seem very strange. Let me begin. Let me share my screen now. Entering. Okay, let me admit. Okay, someone's admitting the people. That's fine. There's a famous Rashi on Shemot 24/7. It's a nice coincidence that's where the pasuk comes out in Sefer Shemot. And Har Sinai, what are we told? Moshe takes Sefer Abrit. Unclear what that is. He reads it in front of the people, and everyone answers Naseh v'nishma. The whole nation answers Naseh v'nishma to Abrit, and then Moshe takes the blood from the korbanot in chapter 24, and he sprinkles the blood on the people. And what's he say? Hinei dam habrit asher krat Hashem imachem al kol dvarim ha'elem. There's a ceremony in Mount Sinai, either right before or right after we receive the Torah, the famous Malchot Rashi and Ramban. But there's a covenant made at Har Sinai, where Moshe is going to read what's called Sefer Abrit. He reads it publicly, and the people answer Naseh v'nishma. For some reason, Rashi makes a very interesting comment. What is Sefer Abrit? What's he reading aloud that the people have to say Naseh v'nishma to? So Rashi claims he's quoting the Mechilta. He says as follows. He says, what's Sefer Bereishit? What's Sefer Abrit? Mi Bereishit vad matan Torah. Mitzvah tisavu b'mara. What Rashi's alluding to here is that what was read in this ceremony, what was read during the 3 days of preparation for Matan Torah. If I follow Chazal, in Rashi's approach is that the end of chapter 20, the beginning of chapter 24 in Sefer Shemot, that whole ceremony at Har Sinai when we said Naseh v'nishma is before we get the 10 Commandments. It's during the 3 days of preparation, the 3 days of Hagbalah. And in essence, what Rashi is claiming is that what are we doing during 3 days of separation? We're not just being separated, and washing our clothes and staying away from the mountain. It's a learn-a-thon, it's a seminar, and that's when he teaches Sefer Bereishit to the people. Now, of course, Sefer Bereishit has meaning for all generations, but what I want to suggest is that Sefer Bereishit was written first and foremost for that generation. Let me just summarize the discussion. It says, even though the books of the Bible carry an eternal meaning that we know, but we know that each book in the Bible was first given at a specific time period. There was an original audience. So what do we have to consider? How much do we have to take into consideration the original audience of the book and relate it to the purpose of the book and its composition? Of course, Sefer Bereishit is necessary for all generations, but it was written only for all generations, or was its original audience the people coming out of Egypt? And I have to take that into consideration when I'm reading it. Even though its message is eternal, I still have to take into consideration its original audience. I'll give you, in Nevi'im, it's easy to see that. Of course, Sefer Yeshua was written first and foremost for his generation. It's got meaning for all generations, but it has a message for a specific generation. Same thing with Sefer Shoftim. Same thing with Sefer Shmuel. They carry eternal messages, that's why they're canonized. But first and foremost, they're written for the generation when it's composed. So for what do we posit? That Bereishit, even though its message is eternal for all generations, it's written first and foremost to the generation that just was redeemed from Egypt. They need to know the roots, who the forefathers were. They need to know about Brit Ben Abtarim. That's why they went through oppression, why God took them out. why they were chosen, what's the purpose of their chosenness, why they went through the repression and redemption we saw, why they're about to enter the land of Israel, why are they going to Canaan, why are they being commanded, what's this Brit all about? Sefer Bereishit is going to give the background for all those things. Now, I want to give some examples of what I mean by this. Number one, I'll start with methodology. Like what we claim all the time is Chumash is a book to study, not just read. You don't read the book. It's not like it's written by a technical writer. Here's a law book of laws you have to keep. The way Chumash is written, and that should be obvious to anyone in the YCT Yemei Iyun or any Yemei Iyun in the Tanach knows, the message of the book is always through its study. And there was therefore, what do you do? What I call when you read Chumash, you have to study Chumash. First, you do an objective analysis of the text, and that analysis is followed by a subjective interpretation. A classic, quick example. You learn the story of creation. The introduction to the story of creation doesn't say, pay attention that day 1 is parallel to day 4, day 2 is parallel to 5, and day 3 is parallel to day 6. But when you study it, right, if you just read it, you wouldn't notice it. When you study the structure of Perek Aleph, and you study its detail and see its format, you'll obviously notice that day 1 is parallel to day 4, day 2 to day 5, day 3 to day 6. That's subjective. Chumash wants you to uncover that. Now, what's the meaning of that? That's what all the interpreters argue. And that's our eternal discussion is, what's the message of the Bible? And that's our heritage. We discuss that all the time. But Chumash is begging interpretation. And it's not just a law book, oh, here's what you have to do. It's a book of principles and ideas. And the way you derive the message through the study of the book. Now, what interpretations are legit? That's a educational discussion of can everyone interpret any way they want, or do you have to follow certain guidelines, and only certain people with certain generations were allowed to interpret? That's a philosophical discussion. But there's no doubt the book was written that requires study, not just to be read. Of course, we assume divine authorship by God, but with a purpose. So what I want to claim is God gave the Jewish people this book, not to know how he created, but why he created. Not to know that we're chosen, to know why we're chosen. And when I consider that the book was written first and foremost for the generation receiving the Torah at Har Sinai, it'll help us understand some details. So let me show you how it affects how we read. So the first example, as I sort of mentioned already, the story of creation in 7 days. Did it just so happen that God created in 7 days and therefore we keep Shabbat? Or God had already given us Shabbat and Marah. We had this Shabbat we had Shabbat with the Mom. Is God giving us Sefer Bereishit and telling us about creation in 7 days to give meaning to Shabbat, or to tell us what he did? Do I need to know how God created? And it just so happens it was 7 days, and therefore I keep Shabbat? Or how God created, that's his problem. It could take him millions and billions of years. That's God's problem, how he created. But God gives us a creation story so that when we keep Shabbat, it gives meaning to Shabbat. And therefore I need to study the story of Shabbat, not to know that he created or how he created. I need to know when I'm keeping Shabbat as a Jew, to remember my commitment to God, the story of creation is going to make my keeping Shabbat meaningful. How it does it, a topic for its own discussion. But that's my point. When I'm studying the Bible, am I reading the story of creation as an historian to know what happened, or am I reading a book where God's trying to explain to me why I'm keeping Shabbat and why he chose this, etc. Now, so that was one example. Now we'll get the fun ones. I want to make an assumption, which I think is logical, that in the time when the Torah is given, every culture brings sacrifices. There's no such thing as a religion without sacrifice. Every nation, everyone sacrifices. Any historian will tell you that. Sacrifice seems to be human nature from ancient times. And nowadays, you want someone to be someone can help you, take him out to lunch. You kill an animal and you go sit and eat a meal together. So if you want God on your side, any God, small g, you bring him sacrifices and maybe he'll listen to you. Now, Chumash is going to start, we'll see as we go on, Chumash is really, it's not proliferating sacrifice, it's trying to give the meaning. I want to share an idea that it could be that the way the Torah tells the story of the flood might be to help us understand and give deeper meaning to Korbanot. Why is that? Before the flood, I'm going to take something in the flood story. It's just a real short example. Let me jump ahead. In when we have the korbanot in Parshat Pinchas with the korban tamid. Look in Perak Chavchet in Sefer Bamidbar. If you have a Chumash open, take a look in your Chumash. I have the source there. Everyone knows the Psukim Bahar. We read it every Rosh Chodesh. Vaydaber Hashem Moshe lemor. Savet bnei Yisrael b'amata lehem et korbani lachmi liishai reich nichochi tishmu li lakri b'modom. Command the Jewish people and tell them, the bread of my sacrifice, my daily portion of bread. Reich nichochi. My reich nichoach. What's it say in English? My sweet smelling something. Spirit of satisfaction. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure what reich nichoach means. It's some sweet smell. But this is the introduction that what is the purpose of the korban tamid, of the daily korban? It's my reich nichoach. Make sure to bring me at the right time. That's the opening line. And now another dibor, the daily korban tamid, kvasim. And every korban, every day, every holiday, always say reich nichoach. Reich nichoach is the buzzword. Now, does God need to be fed? Any modern thinking mind is, of course, God doesn't need to be fed. God doesn't eat. Why do we need to bring a reich nichoach? So I can look at the flood story to give meaning to korbanot. The korban is not to feed God. We need to do some action that reminds us of our relationship with God. What's the meaning of bringing a korban? What does a korban, when I bring a korban, what does it mean to me? So because we're bringing korbanot anyhow, that's what people do, I want to make sure the korban has meaning. When Chumash tells the story of the flood, what does it say? Before the flood, what are we told? Listen carefully. Before the flood, remember, Hashem sees that man is evil. God is simply upset with man's behavior. They're just bad all the time. His yetzer is just bad, call it all day long. Menachem Hashem, God is sorry. He regrets that he made man. He's angry. Okay? Remember these key words. And God says, and God decides, I'm going to get rid of my creation, get rid of man and everything that comes with him. He brings the flood. When the flood is over, remember, God promises not to do that again. What leads God to make this new decision? Noach builds a mizbeach, remember? And he takes from the 7x7 animals, the animals that are tahor. He brings korbanot. Remember, vayal olot b'mizbeach. He takes the animals that are good for sacrifices. Now we have a korban olah. We have korban behemat Torah. A behemat Torah is a behemat that can be used as a sacrifice, sheep and cattle and certain birds. What happens when it brings a korban? By Yarach Hashem et reach nichoach, the first time we have the phrase reich nichoach, God smells the reich nichoach, and what does he say? Vayim Hashem el libo, lo osif lekelo olet adama bavor adam, ki yetzer lev adam ramenu rav. Now, that's exactly the opposite that we saw before the flood. Now, what do we have? Here we have, highlight this. When the flood is over, what does God say? Man's yetzer is bad in his youth, implying he can learn and grow up, like a teenager can grow up. He starts off bad, but he can fix things. We're living in a world of tikkun. Before the flood, what did he say? Ki yetzer machshavot libo rak halayom. There's no hope for man. So if I compare the reason for the flood, God's reason to bring the flood, and God's decision not to bring another flood, and see how the theme of reich nichoach is key, then when I bring a korban that now brings reich nichoach to God, it's not to feed God, but rather it's to remind me that we're living in a world of tshuva. That man can have bad behavior, I can learn from my deeds, and therefore I'm going to do some symbolic act. I'll perform a ritual, bring a korban. That's what everyone did. But instead of turning a korban into feeding a God and thinking you can placate a God by feeding him, now when I bring a korban, that korban's going to remind me of this idea that we're living, that God understands that man tends to be bad, but he can repent. We're living in a world of tshuva. Yes, I'm Ramanu Rav, and I can fix my ways. The whole theme of, I picked that topic because Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is coming up. And again, I'm just giving an example where what I'm suggesting is that the way the Torah tells the flood story and highlights these ideas of reich nichoach is to prepare me for the laws at Har Sinai of the korban tamid and the korban tamid and musaf, which are reich nichoach Hashem. How am I going to take a pagan custom which is meaningless and can be misleading, and turn it into a meaningful relationship with God. Now, let me give you, which I think are much better examples. I'm going back to the flood again. Remember, when I read the story of the flood, to anyone who studies it, not just reads it, but studies it, in contrast to what happens in Sefer Shemot, there's so many parallels, which you'll see are super obvious, between Noach and Moshe, between the flood story and Har Sinai. I'll just bring some examples. The word teva, which is never used for a ship or a boat or anything. It's a sfina, right? But a teva is unique to the flood story and to Moshe's birth. That's unique to Moshe and Noach. Both Moshe and Noach are Menachem b'nei Hashem. If I'm not mistaken, no one else in Chumash is described as someone who was Menachem, who found favor in God's eyes. Both the flood story and Har Sinai are unique, and they're both stories of 40 days and 40 nights. Right? And it's highlighted 40 days and 40 nights in both stories, both in Har Sinai and the flood. There's 7 days before the flood, and there's 7 days preparation for Har Sinai. Remember in Parshat Mishpatim in Perach Daled, by Chaseun and Shesh Yamim, and Moshe goes B'Mashvi Mitoch Ha'anam. There's 7 days prior, and then 40 days, and then Moshe's up there for 40 days and 40 nights. The sources, we don't have time to read them, but you can take my word for it. Right before the flood, remember, we have Admei Avesrim. It's referring to a man can live 120 or 120 years to the flood. Big argument, but the only one who lives 120 years in the Bible is going to be Moshe. We'll get another parallel. But the key idea is that God saying, let me destroy everyone and make you the only one. God tells Noah, let me destroy everyone and make you the only one. Noah accepts it. God tells Moshe the same thing, but Moshe davens and changes that. But those are all parallel. There's a setup. It begins with the flood story begins with Hashchata, but Tishchas Lifnei Elohim, but Timas Hamas. God tells Moshe, Lechet Kishichet Amcha. And the key thing are both stories have covenants that follow. And both covenants that follow with stories, God's going to have a relationship where, with Midat Rachamim, remember, God says, I'm not going to curse man because Yetzer Libo Rabbi Rabbins, he can fix his ways. And just way in the end of Har Sinai, we have Midat Rachamim, where God now has a more forgiving relationship with his people. Now, I'm sure all of you know that there are at the time of Har Sinai, when we're leaving Egypt, in ancient Egyptian culture and ancient Mesopotamian culture, there are numerous flood stories. There's flood stories are floating over the whole ancient Near East, aren't they? Anyone who studies them, there's tens of flood stories all through the ancient times. And there's law codes like Hammurabi and things like that. Once you follow this approach, then what's my point? That Chumash is using well-known myths and stories about flood stories, creation myths. Here, let me I have it right here in the discussion. Okay, there's known traditions, and we're using them as a platform to introduce a new theology. So, what's my point? If I'm reading Sefer Bereishit, and if the original audience is aware of some law code which is similar to Hammurabi, might have been something similar in Egypt. If people are aware of flood stories, which are polytheistic in their essence, and creation stories, Chumash is using them as a platform to introduce new ideas. So let me give you an example of what I mean by this. I have a friend, a wonderful rabbi. Hope he doesn't mind that I quote him on this. Rabbi Rosenberg from Queens. He teaches in SAR. A couple of years ago, he wrote the Harry Potter Haggadah. Some of you are probably familiar with it. Now, what was his assumption? Let me take a quick break from the screen for a minute and see people a little bit. What was his assumption? Why did he write the Harry Potter Haggadah? What's wrong with the Haggadah the way we have it? His assumption is his audience, who's his original audience, are school children growing up in the United States who have Bekias in Harry Potter, like they know the Harry Potter called, and their understanding of Judaism is minimal. What's he want to do? He's taking as a platform something they're aware of and using that to teach ideas that they can relate to much better based on the culture they're growing up with. So he's going to use Harry Potter, which they're familiar with, and use that to teach Magi. Now, that book for a Haredi Israeli living in Mea Sharim or Angola would be meaningless because he doesn't know Harry Potter. Maybe nowadays they do. But to a child who's not aware of Harry Potter, then that book wouldn't mean anything. But for someone who's aware of that culture, then I'm using an existing culture to give over an idea. So by taking the flood story and changing it, that's what I mean by platform. I'm taking a given story and changing its details, and making it not no monotheistic. That was what's name? Sarna's beautiful work on Genesis, and I'm pretty sure it's called Understanding Genesis, where he claims that the Bible takes polytheistic stories and makes them monotheistic. I think it's much more than that. It's not just, oh, I'm taking stories and changing them around to make them monotheistic. I'm using stories that are well known as a platform to teach a generation of a slave people who have been in slavery for hundreds of years, but aware of Egyptian culture and ancient Near Eastern culture. And I need to introduce to them new ideas so they understand why they're chosen and where they're coming from. And in light of that, and that can explain why Chumash uses a flood story, and why Chumash talks about Reach Nicholach, and why Chumash talks about brings creation the way he does. And that's why we're going to find so many similarities between Chumash and ancient Near Eastern sources, which everyone who studies, Bible academically is always scared by. With this approach, it makes a lot of sense now. It's not that Chumash isn't doing copy paste. Chumash has to take a nation of, again, with slave mentality, with a given culture. Remember, we see from Yechezkel, we're living in Egyptian culture. Remember what Yechezkel says? We can't get rid of our Egyptian culture. We're ingrained. It's ingrained in us. The ways of Egypt. That's what we're familiar with. We have to re-educate an entire people, and by using an existing culture as a platform to teach new ideas, that can explain to us why we find so many of these parallels between the stories in the Bible and the stories in ancient Near East. It's not that I'm coming to counter them, with a counter theology. I'm using them as a platform to launch this new idea. Now, assuming there's 12 tribes in Egypt, where are these tribes coming from? What's the background? I need the story of our forefathers. I need to know why Abram was chosen. I need to know who Ammon and Moab are. I need to know who Esav is. I need to know the background, because as we come out of Egypt, we're going to come to Israel. I need to know about the land of Canaan. I need to know why the Canaanites are so evil, why God's commanding us to get rid of them. I need to know who our neighbors are, why I can't fight Ammon and Moab, but why we can't marry them. There's tons of things I need to know. Even the story, where our mother comes from, things like that. So again, when I'm reading Sefer Bereishit, if I read it as being written first and foremost for the generation that comes out of Egypt, it helps me understand much better a lot of its details. Now, what problem comes up? I'm sure which is going to be bothering people. Then what does a person do who doesn't know? What happens 1,000 years later when I'm reading Sefer Bereishit? I'm not aware of ancient flood stories. I'm not aware of Hammurabi Code. I'm not aware of creation myths. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to handle Chumash properly? That's a different discussion. Chumash is able, the reader of Chumash is able to get its message even if he's not aware of that. If you are aware, you'll understand it better. Now, it's not that I can't get the message if I don't know those stories, but if I know those stories, the message will be enhanced. So let me check the chat real fast, and we'll continue. Okay, I'll get the source sheet. You should be able to share that. And okay, about whether Ozzy's question, whether man is born with Yitzhak or not, that's a philosophical question. Is man born bad and can do better? But anyone who brought up a teenager or was a teenager once in their life knows that you tend to do things that are bad and you learn from your mistakes. In fact, if people didn't make mistakes and do things that are bad, they would never grow. You don't do things bad on purpose or evil, but if you were living in a road, you live tikkun, where you grow by learning from your mistakes. You make enough mistakes trying to do good that you don't have to try to do bad. You can try to do good and you'll do plenty of bad things. Now, let's go back to my screen share and continue with my source sheet over here. Okay, so that was discussion on platform. Now, this idea of Brit, what I want to show you now is how, in an intricate manner, Chumash uses the flood story and that idea I told you about, Reach Nicholach, etc., and the flood story, to introduce this idea of why we're chosen. What happens? Everyone knows the concept of Brit. Remember, Brit Sinai. The Brit is, he's our God, we're his people. God chooses us, nation, to serve him. God picks Avram Avinu because he wants a nation that's going to serve him forever, but the nation has to begin somewhere. So it begins with a goal. That's Chalagoy Gadol. I want you to become a nation. You have to have children. You have to become a nation. You have to go through slavery in someone else's land, and Brit Ben Abtarim, and then redemption. You need a land to become a nation. I set aside the land of Canaan. I have to get rid of those people there because of their bad behavior. And then you get the land to behave better than them. Otherwise, you don't have the right to the land. So Sefer Bereishit develops those ideas. But if you look in the story of the flood, there's going to be developing a theme, which I think is key to understanding the nature of our chosenness. What happens? What does God tell Noach after the flood? Remember, we saw the flood b'Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei with the Rech Nichoch with the Korban. Remember, just like Yud Kei Vav Kei promises the flood, and then after the flood says, "I'm not going to do it again." Also, Hashem b'Shem Elokim has a reason for the flood, and after the flood says He's not going to do it again. Famous rainbow covenant. So listen what Elokim tells Noach in Pasach, right after the 7 Noachai laws. Elokim tells Noach, I'm going to make a brit with you and all your offspring and every living thing, everything coming out of the Teva. Listen to the wording of Pasuk Yud Aleph, and keep this in mind. That phrase, I'm going to establish a covenant with you. Right? And I'm not going to bring another flood. It means I'm not going to start over again. There won't be another flood, but understand basically God's limiting his powers. He's saying, I can't destroy again. I can punish a certain nation, a certain people, a certain area, but I'm not going to hit the restart button like I did with the flood. I'm not going to start from scratch again. God can, but God decides what he can't do. God is allowed to limit, like I think they call it Tzimtzum in Kabbalistic terms, but God's limiting his powers. He can do something, he decides something he can't do. God's deciding, I'm making a covenant with my creation, I'm not going to do that again. And what's the reminder, the Ot Brit? Between Benu Menachem, at Kasir Natati Banan, I'm going to make that rainbow, and that'll remind me that'll be an Ot Brit, Benu Ben Haaretz. Okay, then remember, we're going to quote this in Zichronot, the Zacharti Briti, Benu Benechem, Benefesh Kol Chaya. I'm sure you remember from Zichronot that when we do in Musaf, when we do Zichronot, we begin with the story of the flood, don't we? With Atazocher at the Brit. For some reason, in Zichronot, we don't only talk about Brit Avot, we talk about Brit Noach as well. Okay? Then by Takesh Shevana, Briti, it's called Brit Olam, Ben Olim, Benefesh Kol Chaya. Why do I need this Brit, this rainbow covenant? Why is it so central to understanding God's covenant with us? And then finally, it's a Brit Olam. Remember the key words. It's a Brit Olam, the Dorot Olam. It's a Brit Benu Ben, between God and his creation. And it's B'Shem Elokim. And there's an Ot Brit, there's a sign of the Brit. We have the exact same wording, the same terminology in God's covenant with Avram Avinu, they become a nation called Brit Milah. This is all similar wording. Remember, Avram's 99, and Elokim speaks to man in chapter 9, in what's called Brit Keshet. The next time Elokim speaks to anyone in the Bible is in chapter 17 in Brit Milah. So Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, who's been talking to Avram ever since Lachacha, introduces himself, now I have a new name, and the El Shaddai, a commandment, how to behave, that's what Noach was, that's what Avram needs to be, and his children. I'm going to make a brit, again, Ben Yubain, the word brit, between two sides, and then Elohim now speaks to Avram. Avram falls on his face, by the very to Elohim lemor, I'm going to now make a brit with you, and the purpose of a brit is you're going to be a mentor, an Av, not a father too, but a father to, not a father of many nations, but a father to many nations, means a mentor. But I'm choosing you to be this light to other nations, and therefore to remember that your name is to no longer be Avram, but to be Abraham. I'll multiply you so you can become that nation. I'll give you leadership. I'm setting you aside for the purpose of other nations. And then finally, the same phrase like we had by the flood. This is the brit of the Bible. We sing about it. Remember, why did God take us out of Egypt? The last line of the Kriyat Shema. Ani Hashem Elokechem asher tzeitti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim lo l'chad Elohim. Remember, Anu Amecha Te Eloheinu, we sing on Yom Kippur. the core brit, God is entering an eternal covenant, a brit olam, an eternal covenant, just like there was a flood covenant. Now there's a brit olam between God and his people. Shem Elokim, a brit, and now we need an oath brit. Now I'm setting aside the land of Canaan in order that I can be your God there. I'm giving you and your offspring the land you're living in, the land of Canaan, for an eternal inheritance. And there I'll be your God, meaning God wants a nation to be a nation into the land. Therefore, God's setting aside the land of Israel as a vehicle through which we become his nation. But the goal of it to be your God. And then keep my covenant. And what's going to be the Od Brit will be Himod Lachem Kol Zachar, Unmatemet Basar Lechem, Vayala Od Brit, Benu Benechem. What am I pointing out? When I read Sefer Bereishit, I came out of Egypt already. But I'm telling the story of the flood and the story of Avram's covenant with God in similar terminology. And we're going to use the exact same phrases at Har Sinai. At Har Sinai, it's going to be a Brit Olam. There'll be an Od Brit. Shabbat will be the Od Brit. There'll be Lot Lachel Elohim. We'll see the exact same phrases over and over again. All through Vayikra. Maybe we'll read some of them in a minute. I'll give a couple examples real fast. In of Lot Lachel Elohim, when we think I have this source sheet real fast. And we are. Remember the 4 cups when we come out of Egypt in chapter 6 in the generation of the desert. Go to Bnei Israel, Ani Hashem. Otzeti etchem, ever bitzalti etchem, v'galti etchem. What's the 4th cup? V'lachalti etchem li la'am, v'ati etchem Elohim. V'yidatem ki Ani Hashem Elohim, Hashem otzi etchem eretz Mitzrayim. This is Sefer Shemot. This is what they heard before they came out of Egypt. And then at Har Sinai, and then I'll bring you to the land. At Har Sinai, what are they told? If you follow my laws and keep my brit, you'll be my treasured nation. I need Sefer Bereishit to understand what Brit Sinai is all about. Now, why is it that we develop so much time? Why do we spend so much time in the introduction about the flood story and this idea of the covenant after the flood, which is Bakimoti Briti, that there won't be another flood, followed by similar wording in the covenant with Avram Binu, that I'll be your people, and then that's at the seed level, it becomes official at Har Sinai. If you go back to Parshat Nitzavim, which we're going to read this week, that's why I picked the topic for this week. Remember in Parshat Nitzavim, what did God say? Etc. To enter a covenant with God, in order to establish you as his nation, he'll be his God. Kasher diber lach, like he told you at Har Sinai. This phrase, it's so central to all Chumash. And my claim is that because it's so central, when Am Yisrael receives the Torah at Har Sinai, and receives the laws of Har Sinai and the laws of Sefer Devarim, it's so central that I need Sefer Bereishit is using as a platform the flood story, and then how God enters the covenant with Avram with Brit Milah to understand this idea. Now, I'm going to use Yeshayahu to try to give a reason of what we gain from this analogy. What do we know from Yeshayahu? Chapter 54 in Isaiah. It's called Rani Akara. What does God say? Remember, there's a Shiva and Nechamta. These are God's promising redemption. The people are in exile. They think their covenant with God is over. What's God saying? Ki meinoch zotli. My promise to bring you back to Israel, even though you're in exile. It's like the waters of the flood of Noach. Asher nishbati me'avor meinoch od al haaretz. Just like I promise, I'm not going to bring another flood. Ke nishbati mikstof alech migarbach. The same way I promise, I'm not going to destroy you forever. I might punish you. I might send you in exile. But my covenant is eternal. That's why this is after for Parshat Noach as well. What's Yeshayahu saying? Just like I made a promise after the flood, I'm not going to do this again, and I promise I'll never break my covenant with nature. I'll never bring another flood, no matter how much I punish an individual city or an area. In the same way, God's choice of the Jewish people is eternal, and He can't unchoose us. He might punish us, we might be in exile, but it's never game over. And that understanding is key, because otherwise someone might think, like Yechezkel's dry bones, that exile is an irreversible process like death, and there's no recovery, and therefore he tells them these dry bones will come to life. If I bring another example from Yirmiyahu, in chapter 33, I'm sorry, let me share my screen. Open up in Tanach. I open up Yirmiyahu, chapter 33. I'm sorry, right over here. Sorry, Yirmiyahu chapter 33. What does he say? He uses the same analogy. Okay, Vayidvar Hashem Yirmiyahu more in verse 23 in chapter 33. God says Yirmiyahu, Halo ra'ita ma'am hazeh dibru lemor. Don't you see what the people were saying? This is the time of the exile. The first temple was being destroyed. The people were saying, God abandoned us. He doesn't want us anymore. He cast us away. The people were saying, we're no longer His people. God's sick of us. He doesn't want us to be a nation anymore. This is what Yirmiyahu says, Kol Mar Hashem, Imlo briti yomam v'layla. Just like my covenant with day and night. I think that's His covenant of keeping nature the way it is. Something just like I can't break my covenant with the laws of nature, with heaven and earth. I won't break my covenant with day and night and nature. I won't break my covenant with the offspring of Yaakov and the house of David. Ultimately, I'm going to bring them back, redeem them, and bring them back to their land. Idea of Gula. So you see, Isaiah and Yirmiyahu are taking this idea I'm trying to show you in Sefer Bereishit as a platform to understand Sefer Shemot. Now, on top of that, I think there's something even deeper there. That'll be our last topic, is that if Chumash is using the flood story, again, as a platform to understand why God's picking Avraham Avinu, it's not only the fact that our being chosen is eternal, it could be a thematic connection as well. Why? If God wants man to be good, because He's really upset when man is bad, like we see in the flood story. God gets upset when man is bad. And what could God do every time man is evil? He could simply punish them and start over again. If God promises He'll never destroy civilization again, no matter how bad they are, then what can God do when things go bad? So I need some safety in it. I need something built into creation that's always going to be there to put civilization back in the right direction, at least with that possibility. So because of Brit Keshet, because of God's promise after the flood, never to bring another flood again, God now has a problem. What do I do when civilization goes astray? In light of that, God enters the covenant with Avraham Avinu to be His model nation. So there's always at least one people acting in a way that is going to be this Avraham Avinu will be this light to other nations that they can learn from. Now, that's our goal. That's our destiny. If we live up to that, God doesn't promise it's going to work, but it's always one of the tools that God has. If we keep up our destiny, God will bless us and take care of us as a nation if we live up to that idea. If we don't, we'll be in rehab for a long time. But it's our eternal destiny. If we live up to it, that's up to us. Okay. Now, Ezra's asking about the Akedah. Chazal understand the Akedah. It was the Shvuah by the Akedah is what makes it eternal. I think that's again. It alludes to that because Binishbati Hashem. The first time we have a Shvuah to the Brit is by the Akedah, but it's explicit in Parshat Shavua in Brit Nitzavim. Let me just show you real quick. In Brit Nitzavim, what is God saying? Let's open up my Chumash again and go to Sefer Dvarim. In Brit Nitzavim, in chapter 29, Moshe talked about Brit Chorev. Remember, he made a Brit in Chorev and has the Ten Commandments in the speech from chapters 5 to 26. But then after the speech is over and there's blessings and curses on Har Gerizim and Har Igal, where they're going to read the Torah again, Moshe calls Israel together and tells them, we're gathering in Avot Moav. Before Moshe dies, there's going to be another Brit called Brit Nitzavim, or Brit Avot Moav, another covenant in the plains of Moav. So Shmartem et Divrei Brit Hazot Basitam, right? L'man taskil et kosher tasum. What's this Brit? Listen carefully. It's called Brit Nitzavim. Atem Nitzavim ayom kulchem lifnei Hashem elokechem Rosh Hashanah. You're all gathering now in the 40th year before Moshe dies. Why? everyone, the leaders and all the simple people, women, children, and all professions. In order to enter the covenant that God's making with you, to establish the covenant He made at Har Sinai that He'll be your God, you'll be His people. That's Brit Milah, Brit Sinai. Why wasn't Brit Sinai? Why wasn't Brit Avot and Brit Sinai enough? So Brit Sinai, its goal is forever, but how do we know that God can't break out of the covenant and we can't? So there's a very key point. I think I see Brit Nitzavim as a Brit about a Brit. It's a covenant about the covenant. Why don't we Brit Nitzavim? Once God promises blessings and curses, and God says, follow my laws, I'll bless you to the nth degree. Don't follow my laws, I'll curse you to the nth degree. Someone listening to that contract thinks of a third possibility. You know what? Don't give me the reward, don't give me the punishment. Who needs this headache? There seems to be a third possibility of, I don't want to be a member of this Brit at all. And let's say not just the Jewish people can break out, maybe an individual among the Jewish people might want to break out. Or might someone say, later generations say, I was born Jewish, but maybe I have the choice not to be Jewish. Maybe I can convert out. And therefore, what's God say right away? What's Brit Nitzavim? I'm not only making this Brit with you, the people standing here today, for those living here today and those not living here today, meaning this is a Brit with all future generations. It's binding on all future generations. Why do we do that? Because you had these experiences. You saw what life was like in Egypt. You saw Ammon and Moab. You saw Edom. You saw Sichon. You saw different civilizations. You saw, like I say, you went off to college. You left yeshiva and went off to college. You saw different people. And what might happen? Penish bachem, ish o isha o mishpacha o shevet. Maybe an individual, a male or a female, or a whole family, or even a shevet might say, you know what? We want out. Shevet Reuven says, I don't want to be part of this. I don't like the other tribes. I don't want to be part of this covenant with God. Or an individual person, or male or female, say, I want out. And they'll follow another God. They want to pick a different religion, a different way of life. God says, don't even think about it. Do that, you're going to be, you'll be this rotten apple that will cause other people to go astray, and God's going to stop it and punish you harshly. That's the warning. He's saying, you can't break out. Now, what's this Brit saying? Brit Sinai, which has a goal, it's unclear from Brit Sinai itself whether it's binding on all future generations as well, and whether a Jew, an individual, has the right to opt out or not. A family, an individual. Someone might say it's like pruning a tree. I'm helping Am Yisrael by breaking out. There's a logical reason to think that an individual can break out. Brit Nitzavim is telling you you can break out. But how does that continue? In chapter 30, the most important part, just like you can break out, God also can't break out. And therefore, should all the terrible things happen, like in the curses, the bracha and the kala, and you're in exile, and you want to do tshuva, you can always do tshuva. It's never game over. That's what Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu were talking about. You can return to God, and God will bring you back. We're going to read this in Slichot. No matter where you are, God can bring you back. He'll bring you back to the land, okay? And he'll give you a new start. Okay? And basically, God will always keep Tishma on the condition you follow God's laws, keeping His laws. If you turn to God with your full heart and your soul, meaning what's Brit Nitzavim about? That God's Brit is eternal. So what Ezra was talking about, which Chazal says by the Akedah that God can break out, is explicit in Brit Nitzavim. And I think that's why we need Brit Nitzavim at the end of Sefer, at the end of Chumash, as we graduated at Har Sinai University, the desert university, and we're now ready finally to become His people. We're about to enter the land, conquer it. We need to make a covenant on the covenant. We need to take the Brit Sinai, that's the laws in Sefer Devarim, and on that Brit, we have blessings and curses, and on that whole blessings and curses with the covenant, there's a covenant on that we can't break out and God can't break out. So that's the idea of this eternal covenant. That's the Brit Olam, which I think Parshat Noach sets up the stage for that idea. Just quickly, I'm going to run out of time in a minute. Let me just check the chat real fast, the last two. Okay, we'll take... okay, let me think this one here. How about Father Denny? Okay, so I'm not sure what that is. I think some of the Gaonim say that you could go so far away from Judah that you are no longer. Okay, that's a, you can have theological arguments whether, what defines you. Can someone be defined as a non-Jew if he goes too far? But I'm talking about what God is saying. The core idea that you can't break out of Judaism, let's keep that understand. But I want to look at the flip side. The knowledge, I like to call this a Catholic marriage, meaning the knowledge that you're always God's people and God can't get rid of you forever. The second you know you're in a relationship that you can't get out of, that's going to require you, enable you, that enables the process of tshuva. Because the second you give in hope, that's what Yirmiyahu was talking about. The people are saying, there's no more hope. Yechezkel, we're dry bones. Knowing that you're not dry bones, that one day you can come back to life again, that sparks the process of tshuva. If you think you're a lost cause, it's over. Okay, you'll give up hope. This knowledge, it's a brit olam, it's an eternal brit, and can always be fixed. That's key to Jewish survival. Okay. Now let's finish up. I want to make one last point about how Chumash uses this idea, how Sefer Bereishit develops this idea. And let's go to, again, I can bring all these psukim of Lachel Elohim that will bore you, but that phrase, it's just throughout Chumash. Remember in Bamidbar and Shema, why did God take us out of Egypt? If you can bring at the end of the speech, I'll just bring something from last week's Parsha real quick. This is a better one. What did God say? Remember Hayom Hazeh, at the end of the speech, God says, God's command you keep all these laws. And then we have the exchange of vows. Et Hashem Hamarta Hayom. What you took upon yourself and what God took upon himself. Hashem Emir Hayom. Look at the four things that we took upon ourselves. Number one, follow his ways, doing justice and righteousness, to keep his laws, being diligent in keeping mitzvot, and obeying God. That's what we took upon ourselves. That's our covenantal commitment. And God took upon himself that we'll be his Am Skula, will be his treasure nation forever, or his vassal nation, and to keep all his laws, and to put us in a leadership position above the nations for God's glory, renown, reputation. And that will make us the Goy Kadosh, this Am Kadosh, as he told you at Har Sinai. Meaning, there's this mutual, this phrase, I'm your God, you're my people. That's the song we sing on Yom Kippur. The last line, Anu Mamirecha V'Atam Mamirenu. That's based on the end of the speech in Devarim, where we have Hashem Hamarta V'Hashem Emircha. It's the biggest theme of Chumash, and the idea that it's an eternal thing. And because that's the key theme of Har Sinai, remember the laws in Devarim were first given in Har Sinai. I'm trying to understand Sefer Bereishit. When I'm reading Sefer Bereishit as a book that was given at that time period, when they're getting the Torah, they can help me understand why it's using culture at the time as a platform to develop its ideas. Now, the last idea is the theme of Shem Hashem in Sefer Bereishit. In Sefer Devarim, the laws in Devarim, which again were given in Har Sinai the first time around, we have this Hamakom Hashem Hashem L'Shekein Shmo Sham, to make a name for God. Sefer Bereishit is also going to develop this idea of making a name for God. And remember, I'll just go over briefly. This in itself is a whole share, but the first 11 chapters talk about all civilization, and they're all stories about sin and punishment. In other words, God creates man, and man goes astray, and we need to know that God has expectations from humankind, civilization. He gets angry, he reacts to man's needs, and then God chooses a nation to be his model nation to help lead civilization in a better path. So, if I need to understand in Har Sinai why I'm chosen, so this idea is gonna, when I study Sefer Bereishit from that frame of reference, then this structure of the book, the first 11 chapters being universal, and then from chapter 12, focused on God picking a nation, again, that's going to develop this idea of why we're chosen. So if I want to sort of, there's after creation, I have 4 stories about divine retribution, that God's hashgacha, God not only created, he watches over his creation, but the way he watches is a function of man's deeds. And then I need the story of how and why God starts a nation. And then basically we need to know not that we're chosen, but why we're chosen. And the connection between all nations and the whole team of calling out in God's name. So again, I think my time is up. But that's what I want to share with you. Just a thought. Again, I'm not sure if I'm right. I'll take questions now, but I'm just suggesting that, or entertaining this thought that I can read Sefer Bereishit, transforming myself. I'm asking myself, what would it feel like if I just came out of Egypt? I went through slavery. I went through redemption. I'm aware of Egyptian culture. I'm aware of, ancient Near Eastern culture, things like that. I'm aware of these different things. And then I get to Torah and I see these similarities. The question is the Torah using this existing culture as a platform to develop its ideas? But when I'm reading the book of Bereishit as a book written first and foremost for this generation to understand why they're chosen, of course, have all generations understand why we're chosen forever. But I need to take into consideration its original audience who received the Torah. And I read Sefer Bereishit as a book written as preparation for Matan Torah during that 3 days. That's why I went back to that first Rashi, that if during the 3 days of preparation for Matan Torah, the book that Moshe is teaching the people is Sefer Bereishit, then if I'm going to follow that direction in Chazal, then I'm reading Sefer Bereishit from that perspective. And that can help me understand a lot of the oddities in the book and what's focused on, what's not focused on, and why, it helps me explain the structure of the book, the stories in the book, and why we have all these parallels between, ever from the flood story to, from Brit Keshet to Brit Milah to Brit Sinai, things like that. It explains to me why the flood story is so similar to the Har Sinai story. So I'll stop now and I'll look at the chat real quick and take questions.
Thank you, Rabbi Leibtag. We have 2 minutes as you look at some of the questions in the chat. If you have any questions you want to ask out loud, please just raise your hand. We will probably only have time for about one minute, one question or so, unless from the audience. Otherwise, we'll look at the chat.
Okay. By the way, is there another question now, or is there another share going up? Or this is the end of the morning program, right?
Correct. This is going to be the end of the morning program, and then we'll meet back here at 7 p.m.
Okay. So
Eastern.
if we go overtime, it's not a.
We go overtime. We can do that. If
people want to stay on and talk, it's okay. We can, like in real life, people can stay after the show and ask questions. So if Zoom is still working, we can stay on a little longer. Okay, we take questions now. Okay, Rav Lichtenstein acknowledges that this is a very much a minority opinion. Which, David, what are you talking about there? Where's David? Hi, David. Good to see you. It's much more fun when you.
Hi, Leibtag. Yes, good to see you as well. I was talking about Rav Lichtenstein in the Brother Daniel article, where he's in response to the previous comment, where he talks about there being some opinions that you can lose your status of Jewish if your children don't know their Jewish identity and stuff. But he says it's a minority opinion.
Okay. The question is, do you count them for a minion or not? Things like that. So when you need to say Kaddish, I'm just sort of joking, but what's the nafkamina if you're Jewish or not? I guess there's nafkamina for chuppah and kedushin and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Or if you're at the airport, you need someone to make a minion. So how Jewish do you have to be? Okay. Ezra always asks good questions. Curious how you think Brit Shabbat. I wish I had time to do that, but Brit Shabbat parallels Brit Keshet, doesn't it? It's an old Brit, Beini Ubein. It's Ken Yashem B'Kadishchem. The old Brit of Brit Sinai is Shabbat. So therefore, we have a physical reminder of Brit Sinai, which is the Mishkan, and we have a weekly reminder in the realm of time of Brit Sinai. But keeping Shabbat once a week is our weekly reminder of our commitment to be God's people. But I need a week, I need time out once a week to reflect on what I'm doing with my, I'm resting and stopping creativity to make sure I focus how to use my creativity in the service of God. But again, Shabbat is going to be the wording of Beinu Ben Bnei Yisrael Til Olam goes back to the wording of flood and Brit Milah for sure.